Good evening and welcome once again to the St. Mark Bible Institute program. I'm John Klein, and with me tonight, as usual, is Ken Garrison, pastor of Fellowship Church and founder of the St. Mark Bible Institute. Good evening, Ken.
Good evening, John.
Ken, you know that the book of Revelation is very difficult for people to understand. Did God give us clues to this with the Exodus story?
Yes, I believe he did, John. For the last couple of weeks, they on every evening of Shabbat, Erev Shabbat, we teach through the Torah section right alongside with synagogues doing the same thing across the world. Last couple of weeks, we've been in the Exodus account, and I spent a week also teaching concerning Akhenaten, Egyptian pharaoh, a unique one, and in thinking about that and thinking about the book of Revelation, I believe that there is a direct correspondence between what happened in the Exodus and what is prophesied to happen in the book of Revelation. The Bible, we believe often the Bible, the biblical accounts foreshadows future events, prophetic events, and so therefore, we want to compare the judgments that God brought upon the land of Egypt to those that He's bringing upon the world in the end time.
Okay, so we hope that this will make things easier for you in reading the scriptures, and so we believe then that the way God judged the gods of Egypt, He's going and when Israel 3,500 years ago, he will judge the gods of this world in very much the same manner and in the same way, and he's going to do it.
Right. Now, so we want to, first of all, tonight, look at that specific activity that God humiliated the gods of Egypt during the deliverance of Israel that we know as the Exodus account. And then secondarily, we'll look at the book of Revelation and the promised coming judgments and see if there's a parallel that we can draw, and we believe there is. First, we're going to look at the fact that God specifically challenged the power of Egypt, and He, in particular, He humiliated each of the gods. There was a host of gods in Egypt, and that God dealt with each of those, and to render them as if they were of no effect. And the Bible specifically tells us that in the Exodus account. Maybe John would read for us from Exodus 12:12. I believe that God specifically says this.
Okay, for I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. So, and as we look at the plagues, actually, they're aimed at all the multitude of Egyptian pagan gods.
The Egyptians worshipped a host of gods, and when I say worship those gods, they relied upon those gods for protection and for prosperity and blessing and so on. And they worshipped, almost everything when you really look at the host of Egyptian gods. And so what John just read tells us that God, in the judgments or the plagues that came upon Egypt, systematically focused those to humiliate each of those gods individually to such a degree that it was evident that the gods of Egypt had become inoperative.
Yeah, so, they were just man's imagination and made of man's creation. In fact, he executes judgment against these gods in such a way as declaring a distinction not only between him and the pagan gods of Egypt, but against the Egyptians and the Israelis. He said, I will execute judgment against them, and in the camp of Israel, there won't even be a dog barking, that everyone should know that God declares the distinction between the Egyptians and the sons of Israel.
All right, so God clearly distinguished himself and his people.
And his people.
In that regard.
Right.
All right, so we want to list some of the gods of Egypt. It's not comprehensive because there was a host. Actually, in the Passover account, I think in the normal Passover account, we cite 10 gods. We're not going to go quite that far tonight, but we're going to cite some of the primary gods and how God systematically humiliated them. Okay,
so if we think about Ra is the sun god. So how did God judge that? He put darkness throughout the land. So the Ra, the sun god, was overpowered by the real living God. He did another thing on the earth. They worshipped the fertility of the earth and fertility in general. Isis was that pagan god, and God caused the dust to become lice. So he turned one of their objects of worship, like Mother Earth, into an annoying creature.
Right, exactly. In addition, the bull was worshipped, Osiris, in the name associated with, and God calls a judgment to the bull through the death of the livestock in Egypt during one of the plagues. By the way, when Israel came to Mount Sinai, we all know the story about the golden calf, and so that golden calf would have been patterned after Osiris in that sense. So his judgment didn't hold very long for the Israelis because they yielded in that, and we'll see that appear again in history at the time of Jeroboam. Did the same thing. In addition, the serpent was worshipped in Egypt, and if you'll remember the account how Moses had a staff, and he came in the presence of Pharaoh, threw the staff down, it became a serpent. The Egyptian magicians did the same, but Moses' staff or serpent swallowed up the other. So over and over again, the gods of Egypt are rendered inoperative.
Yeah. So they weren't random judgments. God had a purpose in mind, as I read in Exodus 12:12, to humiliate, to judge those pagan gods, drawing a distinction from all the gods of the world are idols, and God, our God, is God.
Let me add to that concept, John, that God, these are the things that the Egyptians were dependent upon, relying upon, and God was showing that you cannot rely on these false pagan gods. There's only one that we can really rely on.
Okay, and today, as we said, we don't have gods made of stone and wood in the same manner, but we rely on all of those things.
We rely on a host of things rather than God.
And the judgments coming in the book of Revelation are directed against those things that we rely on in the same manner.
Absolutely.
Now, the Nile River, get back to the Exodus story, the Nile River was worshipped as a source of life. What did God do? Well, he turned the river into blood where nothing would live in it. He does the same thing, by the way, in the book of Revelation. Pharaoh was worshipped as the royal family. They were divine in that sense. What did God do? He killed the firstborn of the house of Pharaoh, showing that he and he alone is God.
Okay, so now, and there's another a host of other Egyptian gods that were judged along the way. But again, as John read earlier, God systematically brought judgment upon the specific gods of Egypt to distinguish between who he was as a living God and all of the idols. Now, we have what we believe to be a testimony of this fact in history. And there's a wonderful story of a pharaoh, a unique pharaoh in history by the name, we know him as Akhenaten. From time to time, I see on the History Channel, they do a program on Akhenaten. I would suggest that to anyone if you have time to watch it. but we maintain that Akhenaten was the second-born son of the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
Now, that's a tremendous thing. The second-born son, because the firstborn son was killed by God in judgment. The second-born son would have seen all this.
He would have been an eyewitness to these accounts. He would have seen Moses challenging his father, and through that challenging all the gods of Egypt systematically, as we've been talking about.
And the archaeologists have figured out this is the same time period.
Well, from a standpoint of biblical chronology and typical Egyptian chronology, the time frames matches very well, within 30 years. And now we have to remember we're going back 3,500 years.
Right.
And typically, if you go back 3,000, 3,500 years, the chronologies have plus or minus 30, 40, 50 years. So they easily fit in the time. Now, the truth is, you mentioned the archaeologists,
depending on who
biblical scholars and so on. They have long since become committed to very late entry of Israel into the land, the Promised Land, and as a result of that, they deny the biblical.
Okay, but not
chronology.
all of them. So there are those on both sides, right?
But if you look at Egyptian chronology and biblical chronology, and you take it for what it is, then they match very well. And so therefore, Akhenaten, what Akhenaten did was, we maintain that he was the second-born son. One of the things about the account of Akhenaten is that his older brother died in some mysterious way, the one that would have succeeded to the throne. And so when Akhenaten's father died and Akhenaten became the Pharaoh, then he declared that all the gods of Egypt had become inoperative. He shut down all the temples of the traditional gods of Egypt and started a worship of a single God.
A single unknown God. But if you look at it in the same account, this single unknown God had all the attributes of the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he may have been an unknown God, but he describes the God of the Bible as executing this judgment.
He maintained that this singular, previously unknown God was the creator. He was all-powerful, that he was self-existent, and again had rendered all of the gods of Egypt inoperative. Now, the work of Akhenaten was overthrown by the next Pharaoh, or actually a couple down. The next Pharaoh was Akhenaten's son Tutankhamun, but Horemheb in a next generation eliminated the whole witness
because they didn't live through it.
No,
it wasn't personal to them. They wanted all their pagan gods again.
So we maintain that there is a wonderful testimony of the Exodus and what happened in the Exodus in Egyptian history. And you'll have to look at the story of Akhenaten to understand how incredibly miraculous that account is, but it's awesome to consider. Now, we want to go, we talked about the Exodus account and the judgment. We're coming up to Passover soon, and we'll be having a Passover here and reciting all of these events. But we want to now turn this thing and to the thesis that we started with. Do we have some clues for interpreting the book of Revelation from considering what happened during the Exodus? And so we believe that the prophetic picture in the book of Revelation reveals the events that are going to be happening in the last days. And so we believe that God very well may distinguish himself in the last days by judging what we see now as the philosophical gods that the things that man relies upon rather than God. Will God judge those systematically in the same way that he did the gods of Egypt?
So we are maintaining tonight that the deliverance of Israel from Egypt by the hand of God is a foreshadowing of the deliverance of man's reliance on all these false gods from God, with the establishment ultimately in the kingdom of God and the reign of Messiah Jesus. So mankind is going to be set free from this tyranny of all these false gods, just the way Israel was set free from the pagan false gods of Egypt.
Okay, in the book of Revelation then, we see a series of judgment that are spoken of in the last days. And God is bringing something on the world, and we believe He's following the same pattern that we see in the book of Exodus. And the writer of Hebrews tells us specifically that everything that can be shaken will be. John, would you read that?
Okay, let's look at that. Hebrews 12, I'll read 26 and 27. And his voice shook the earth then, but now he has only prophesied, saying, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven. And this expression, yet once more, denotes the removing of those things which can be shaken, as of created things, in order that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. In other words, God's going to shake everything that can be shaken. All of our false gods of this world, our security and our money, in whatever we find security in, all those things are going to be shaken, because there's only security in the Lord and in none other.
All right, John, in the book of Revelation then, what are the specific entities that we see being judged?
Okay, so first thing we see being judged is the environment. And we see there's a host of New Age gods today.
We need to look at that. I want to develop this idea of philosophical gods also, John.
Oh, okay. You mean the earth itself, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mankind and warfare? I was getting a little ahead of myself. The global economy. So we're going to look at those three things and then bring them out a little more. So
okay, I want to make the point then, John, that you listed these three things: the earth, the dominance achieved through warfare and global economy, and these don't sound like gods. But they are gods, because that's what people
we make them a god by relying on them.
In other words, gods today are not molten images that people would have done in the biblical era, but rather philosophical gods that you form a philosophy and then you rely on those things. So we're talking about, it's not so much an image or something, we're talking about what people actually rely upon. And so these are the things that God is going to demonstrate as being false and not trustworthy. Only God Himself.
So now we'll look a little deeper in the environment things, and there's a host of New Age religions with Mother Earth type mentality, and actually some of those ancient religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, looked at that the same way, as the creation being an extension of God Himself. And then we have Algorithm and all of these things. The idea of looking at the creation rather than the Creator. We know we want to save the whales, but we want to deny the creator of the whales. Paul talks about this in Romans 1, giving us the idea that we look to the creation rather than the creator. And he talks about that. That actually is God's judgment on the earth, too.
Right. So all of these things. Now, let's think for a moment. In the book of Revelation, there are a series of judgments referred to. There are 7 seals broken in the early chapters of Revelation, and then the 7th seal opens up a series of trumpets. The first 4 trumpets are environmental in nature. God is judging this concept of worshiping of Mother Earth, that the earth itself is our source of life. So we see that green vegetation is judged, salt water, marine life. We see fresh water and aquatic life, and then ultimately the cosmos itself is judged. The heavens are shaken. And so each of these are environmental in nature, and we believe that just as God judged the Nile River and turned it into blood, people's reliance upon Mother Earth is going to be shaken, because Mother Earth is going to be shaken by these judgments.
Everything that can be shaken will be shaken. We want to look at some of these things. We can't read them all. They're in Revelation 8 and 9, and we'll wind up. Let's look at Revelation 9. I'll read verse 15, 16, and 18.
Now we're going to talk about what at this point? We're not talking about Mother Earth. We're going to talk about warfare.
Warfare. This is the next step now. The power of it can describe the Mother Earth thing. We just couldn't read everything. And now we're going to see the dominance through warfare, and it seems like it might be nuclear in nature.
All right.
So, and the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and the day, the month and the year, were released so that they might kill a third of mankind. And the number of the armies of the horsemen was 200 million, and I heard the number of them. Let's go to verse 18. And a third of mankind was killed by these three plagues, but the fire and the smoke and the brimstone which proceeded out of their mouth. So we get the idea that this is warfare, and maybe even nuclear warfare at this instant.
It sounds like the very attributes of a nuclear bomb explosion.
Okay, so this would end up then, and I'll just read from Revelation 16:16, and they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Armageddon or Armageddon. So we see that this is culminating in this final battle, and mass destruction is coming upon mankind and the earth, judgment for rebellion.
Okay, so we're saying then that one of the things that mankind relies upon is the power that he exerts through military strength, and we believe that very well could be judged. We now see the Iranians developing nuclear weapons, are coming very near that capability, and the Iranians are a suicidal nation. They would be willing to just to create the chaos, to destroy themselves.
Now we say suicidal nation. We're used to individuals strapping bombs to them, but here we have a whole nation with that mentality,
which has already confessed that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So all right. Now we want to go one step further, and we're going to look at the global economic system. Revelation 17 and 18 show us the collapse of the economic system, the harlot. And so if we think about that, many of us, and throughout the world, this global economic system, but very real here in America, many of us have our well-being in our portfolios, knowing that we have some money for the future, and this is a trap of we should have portfolios with investments in them, but we should be relying on God, because this will be judged. And as we see today, our political leaders are just confused. They don't know, they don't have an answer. So you have from the left and from the right opposing answers to the question, and nobody has a handle on it. And
but John, that's true of all of these areas. Maybe we're seeing the beginning of this in the economic system, as you say. All they know to do is throw money at it. Nobody seems to know really what to do with it. The Iranians are developing nuclear capability. Nobody knows what to do with that. And there's all kinds of arguments and counter-arguments concerning climate change and global warming. It's not so evident there's so much global warming now. We're freezing, but what?
Now they're talking about global cooling.
But the truth is, as you said, nobody knows how to deal with these things. All of these things, to me, smells like God's
His hand in it, right?
God is judging the earth and the things that people rely on just the way He did in Egypt. It appears that way to me.
Now, we have on our money, in God we trust. And first of all, that's really a lie. We're trusting in our economic system. But we need to really trust in God because He and He alone has the solution. And remember how it was in Egypt. God distinguished between the Egyptians and the Israelis, God's people and the people of the world. And so if we're trusting in God, He will see us through it. Our hope should be in Him, not in things that mankind creates for our safety, because ultimately, if God's hand's in it, none of those things will save us.
Okay, and so the real question for us as believers today is just what is the source of our sense of well-being and security? Is it in Mother Earth? Is it in the power demonstrated through military? Is it in our 401ks or annuities or savings or properties or whatever? Or is it going to be in God? And we're confident that, as you read from the book of Hebrews,
everything that can be shaken will be shaken. And so we believe that it's already begun, by the way, and it's evident in the economy, in warfare. Those are the three things we looked at in military might. People don't know what to do about the Iranians. There's a depression throughout the world. We don't know how to recover from it. We're not sure. And the environment, so we have half of the experts on either side coming up with solutions. The other half have exactly the opposite solution, Ken, which is confusion.
So as a result of that, we want to exhort you to really think carefully about what's happening and where your reliance is today. I have a book on Bible prophecy. If you'd like to have it, I'll send it to you. Call in and we'll get one of the ladies to put that in the mail to you, and it treats these subjects, we think, very well. Also, we'd like to thank, our congregation is working in a project in Israel, building adjacent to one of the communities in Samaria. And many of you have sent in money to help with that project, and we thank you for that, and would invite others to do so likewise. John's taken a group up there, and we'll be visiting those sites in short order.
And this is the last week up until about the 10th of February, where we could be sure of getting a seat on the plane to fly over there. If you're interested, we're running out of time. Give us a call. Well, that's our program for this evening. Shalom.